Welcome back. Chapter 3. On the last day of September, and with the provisional blessing of the Board of Graduate Studies in hand, Art embarked on his new career as a feminist. Not quite a card-carrying feminist, Art harbored no particular political agenda, and he was smart enough to recognize that he knew next to nothing about contemporary feminist debate or the intellectual tradition on which it was founded. What he did know, however, was the history of the textile industry in Essex County, which had employed a large number of lower and working class women throughout the 19th century. He knew statistics about salary inequalities, employee racial and ethnic demographics, attitudes of management towards its female workforce. Much of this information lay unused in Art's overstuffed filing cabinets or had been relegated to footnote status in his dissertation. If this specialized knowledge made him a feminist, well, then Art supposed he was a feminist, and surprisingly, he was beginning to warm to the idea. What had started as a mercenary undertaking had soon sparked an excitement Art hadn't felt since the early days of grad school. He spent a week poring through his old notes and files in preparation for today when he'd begin his field work. He bought 400 speed 35mm film for his camera, a fresh stack of the 3x5 note cards he preferred, wide-ruled, a medium cardstock, and, for spiritual guidance, a new Magic 8-Ball. The first stop on his itinerary was Wendell's tiny one-room historical society, which shared office space and a single underpaid secretary with the clerk of town records. Her name was Mrs. Florence Reeder, age 71, and she was as much living witness to the region's history as its curator. As Art entered the small offices, Florence called out to him. She kept her focus on centering an ancient folio within a glass table case. Florence recovered from her fright and beckoned Art to join her at the display case. "Oh, Arthur, come see our latest acquisition. It's a journal dating back to the early 18th century. A local farmer's wife." "Have you read it?" She looked horrified. "My stars, no, it's too fragile." She closed the glass lid of the display case and locked it, suddenly suspicious. Art might try to touch it. Art peered in at the folio, which wasn't a bound volume, but simply a collection of brittle pages held together between two loose covers secured with leather cords. She must have been a wealthy farmer's wife if she could afford paper in the early 18th century. "Yes, I was just about to type up a note saying as much for the display. This paper probably came from one of the few commercial paper mills. My guess is the Rittenhouse Mill in Germantown, Philadelphia." Art straightened, surveying the Historical Society's digs. It was almost wholly dedicated to a single chapter in the town's long history, an October day almost exactly 300 years ago when, on a grassy spot now occupied by an old howitzer-turned-war memorial, 3 of which Wendell's daughters were hung by the neck until dead. Despite the simple brutality of the act, it didn't seem like much of a story, in Art's opinion. Not even in the same league as Salem's witch persecutions. Salem's trials had been a bona fide hysteria, a series of lurid courtroom confrontations presided over by a colorful fire and brimstone preacher, Reverend Parris, that ended in the executions of many innocent women, for the most part condemned on the basis of spectral evidence. The mere fact that the accusers said they saw the specters of the accused women tormenting them was admitted into a damning form of evidence. Talk about insubstantial cases. By the time Wendell's blip on the historic radar occurred 7 years later, the new Commonwealth of Massachusetts had outlawed spectral evidence in witch trials. Though Wendell's 3 witches were blamed for a long list of worldly and otherworldly woes, unexplained fires, stillborn children, sudden illnesses, inconvenient weather, what ultimately brought them to trial were a series of very real crimes, all with the same outcome: murder. And so, as far as Art was concerned, Wendell's witchy past was actually a criminal, not a hysterical one. Of course, trying to explain that to Mayor Delolio or the town board of trustees, all of whom salivated over the potential tourist revenue generated by Wendell's past. Isn't it interesting, the cynic in Art thought, that Wendell's interest in its own history began right after its flagship industry collapsed? Hence the original street signs: Chestnut, Oak, Maple, rechristened Witch Hill, Familiar Way, Black Cat Crossing. Hence the new emblem on Sheriff Bill Nottingham's patrol car, a witch in silhouette, complete with broomstick. Hence the annual King Frost Halloween Parade with its witch float and brigade of sexy witch majorettes. And hence the Witch Museum, the entrance to which Art could just see now, annexed off the Historical Society's one-room headquarters. It was more of a wax museum, really, and a pretty pathetic one at that. Art had once visited a more impressive museum in Vermont dedicated to the history of maple syrup. Oh, they had a few spooky dioramas with a half-dozen old department store mannequins tricked out in colonial garb. No one seemed to mind that these Puritan women wore eyeshadow and lipstick. And Florence had tried to lend a little class to the displays by hanging wall placards that outlined the scanty details of the event. But don't fool yourself. Wendell's Witch Museum had no loftier ambitions than the average Carney Chamber of Horrors. Florence caught Art's disapproving look in the direction of the Witch Museum entrance and said gently, "I always enjoy your visits, Arthur. It's nice to talk to someone who is interested in real history." "I hope you can help me, sweetheart. I'm trying to find a list of the 38 women who died in the mill fire of 1899. "You want names?" Florence said with a discouraging look. "That's the idea." She sighed at the task and led Art into a back room heavy with the smell of moldering newsprint, and together they searched the archives. Art noticed Florence's hand trembling as she brought forth old newspaper clippings. The skin of her liver-spotted hands was nearly the same papery texture as the fragile clippings themselves. He thought he caught a whiff of something medicinal on her breath, and decided finally that it was scotch. "No names in the Boston papers," Florence announced after several moments of close reading. "Just a record of the tragedy itself. 38 souls perish in Inferno. My, but that's rather biblical." "I'm not having any luck with the local daily either," Art said. Then his eye snagged on something curious in the yellowing text. He read aloud, "Though arson is suspected by police officials, local opinion, particularly among the elderly citizenry, attributes the blaze to a centennial curse laid upon the town's founding fathers." Art looked up from the news clipping. "Know anything about a curse, Flo's?" She flashed him a proud look. "I wouldn't know. That's long before my time." And Art put an arm around her and gave her a squeeze. "Of course it is, sweetheart. I only meant, when you were a little girl, do you remember any of the old-timers talking about a town curse?" "In fact, I do remember some talk. Campfire stories. My Uncle Reginald would scare us with stories about Wendell's curse. I'm afraid I'm a little fuzzy on the details," she said, and made her own spooky story face. "But there was talk of a restless evil in the woods." She took the newspaper clippings from Art and began rifling them according to her own eccentric system. "Speaking of woods, if you really want to find the names of your 38 mill workers, you might try visiting their graveyard out in Milton Woods." "Graveyard?" "Yes. The mill owners donated a little parcel of land on the outskirts of town to the families of the dead. That's how businesses settled out of court in those days. The women who died were all poor immigrants anyway and couldn't afford grave plots in the Catholic cemetery." Her eyes twinkled. "Not many people know about that graveyard." Art gave her a kiss. Her cheek was downy, soft as tissue. "That's why I came here first," he said, and slung his camera strap over his shoulder. "25 minutes later, he was hiking along old deer paths, or perhaps mountain bike trails, in the dense woods that encircled the Milton textile mills. He had to park on a gravel shoulder off Old Winthrop Road to gain access to the woods, because if he'd parked any closer to the condemned mills, he would have quickly drawn the attention of the local police. The great rusting mills stood like shrines to a forgotten faith, and like all condemned places, they drew a steady traffic of pilgrims looking for the illicit, which for Wendell meant fraternity plebes, vandals, amateur photographers, and the more adventurous teen lovers. Trespassers braved not only the general spookiness of the place, but also tetanus, sprained ankles, and the wrath of the local police department. Nonetheless, the textile mills still held a nostalgic fascination, and Art wasn't the first townie who sacrificed his virginity on the iron altar of these rusting cathedrals. Within moments of entering the woods, Art was lost, though he wouldn't admit this to himself for another quarter of an hour. He wasn't particularly concerned, since his instinctive directional sense had been honed during a childhood spent tramping through woodlands. He knew with innate confidence that these woods were bounded on one side by Old Winthrop Road to the south and Miller Creek to the east, that if he wandered too far to the north, he'd emerge in the manicured backyards of the new single-family developments of Darley Springs. But he'd expected to find the graveyard Florence had told him about in closer proximity to the mills, and after 3/4 of an hour now of persistent searching, he'd seen no sign of it. That was when he stumbled upon an entirely different graveyard. He almost tripped over the little girl. He let out a startled yelp at the sight of her, lying still on a sunny patch of grass among tumbled gravestones. For a split second he was certain she was dead. Something about the play of shade dappled sunlight made her look broken. He took 2 panicked steps backward and fell, tripping on the tree roots and landing hard on his tailbone. His teeth clacked together and he winced, tasting blood. His heart trip-hammered behind his ribs as he spun out the implications of what he'd found. A dead girl. A serial killer's dumping grounds. Then she whimpered. Art felt his fear shift palpably within him, just as the little girl shifted in her sleep, and became something less focused. Curiosity, surprise, confusion. He steadied himself against the tree that had tripped him and waited, the way you wait a few moments before trying again to start a flooded car. The girl was sucking on the 2 middle fingers of her right hand. Art climbed to his feet and moved a little closer. What in the world is this little girl doing alone in the woods? From the sight of crayons, storybooks, and stuffed animals nearby, it seemed this was her secret place. He followed that thought up to the gray screen of trees beyond, and wondered in which direction her home lay. How far could a child this young travel? She couldn't be older than 7 or 8. He moved closer now and examined the gravestones that had undoubtedly attracted the little girl to this place. Sarah Hutchins, condemned witch, hanged this day, 1699. Before he could even question why he was doing it, Art had snapped the lens cap off his camera and captured 4 shots of the gravestone. Near it lay 2 others with similar epitaphs, differing only in name: Rebecca Cole, Elizabeth Wither. The Wendell witches. It had never occurred to Art that they might actually have graves. Finding them here somehow diminished them in his mind, and Art couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment. We want our historic figures to keep their mystery, to inhabit that hallowed place in our collective consciousness we keep for the vaguely unreal, like movie stars and saints. Finding these graves only reminded him now that they were real women who had suffered real lives of savage brevity. Why had they murdered? The question of motive, the first question of any self-respecting homicide detective, had gone unasked for the 40 years of Art's life in Wendell. He couldn't remember, and had a nagging suspicion he'd never really known. Did anyone remember? Was motive such a 20th century concern that it had escaped the historic record? Young women in the colonies, particularly religious fanatic ones, didn't routinely murder their husbands and neighbors. What, then, had pushed these 3 to those types of crime? Art felt a tremor of excitement as that single simple question began to branch and bifurcate into a more intricate pattern of inquiry, blooming in his mind's eye like a fractal flower. Suddenly his dissertation seemed ugly by comparison. Click, 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 click. Art spent the rest of the 35mm exposures capturing gravestones from different angles. He had to step over the sleeping little girl and felt guilty doing it, but she seemed to be sleeping peacefully enough, and anyway, it was just for a moment. He rewound the roll of film, slipped it into a canister, recapped the camera. Now to the little girl. Should he leave her? Wouldn't she be even more frightened to be woken by a stranger? He crouched down beside her and touched her arm. Immediately, his decision was made. She was hot, burning with fever. He knew with primal certainty that what he felt was danger, another animal in distress. And now, closer to her, he could see the strange bruising beneath the skin of her face and neck. She whimpered a little as he slipped his hands beneath her. When he went to move her, he saw that she seemed entangled in the weeds on which she lay, almost as if the ground itself was sending runners to hold her down, like Gulliver among the Lilliputians. The sun suddenly disappeared behind a cloud, and the day took on a chill. Art stood and staggered a step beneath her unexpected dead weight. It was going to be a real trial carrying her back through the woods. He set off, his feet crunching through the underbrush. Behind them, the trees rustled in agitation. Wendy sighed deeply as the class finally ended. She gathered her books and notebooks into a pile, wondering if she'd ever be able to make sense out of all those arrows she'd drawn. Notes taken in class had a curious way of becoming as indecipherable as hieroglyphics in about a week's time. "Don't forget, people," Professor Gorgas called out over the general hubbub. "Your list of lab assignments and due dates are down here. Pick them up before you go. I won't listen to excuses later. You have plenty of time. And be sure to show your work." "Shall we?" Wendy asked, indicating the stack of assignment sheets. "Ladies first," Alex said with a sweeping gesture. "This is real late in the late 20th century, you know," she said. "Then I won't offer to carry your books or toss my coat on mud puddles." Wendy laughed. "I don't know, that mud puddle thing might come in handy." She stuffed an assignment sheet in her notebook without looking at it, handed another to Alex, who made the mistake of looking at his paper before filing it. He frowned. Who knew stargazing could be so much work? Wendy stepped out the main doors of Locke Science Center. Professor Gorgas's astronomy class was not shaping up as she'd expected. Wendy had selected astronomy as an elective, imagining nightly field trips to the Crown Observatory, definitely not imagining long formulas that tried to cram as many Greek letters in them as an Athens telephone directory. "You parked in East Lot again?" asked a familiar voice behind her. She turned and saw it was Alex. She nodded. "Why do you ask?" "It so happens I'm headed that way." Alex winced and quickly put his sunglasses on. Wendy stood beside him, watching Alex grin, then replied, "I may be, but you've got to be fast." She laughed and quick-stepped down the tree-lined walkway to East Lot, for the moment not caring who might see her acting goofy. When they reached the Gremlin, she was out of breath, more from laughing all the way than from the actual distance they'd covered. Wendy had the feeling he was about to say something. Something about her? "So, where exactly are you headed anyway?" she asked. "Run some laps," he said. "Spec's the other way across campus," Wendy said. Spec was the new, sprawling Schwartz Physical Education Center. "You just wanted to spend a little quality time with me, right?" Oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. Maybe Alyssa is right. Maybe I am cracking under the pressure of non-Wendalers. Alex just smiled. "That's probably a better reason than the real one," he said. "I'm going over to Marshall Field." "A better reason? Marshall Field? That place is a dump. Why go way over there?" "Solitude," he said. "I like to run several miles a day without a lot of distractions. Helps me focus. Coach doesn't mind if I practice at Marshall on my own time." "Well, that's a long walk," she said. "Why don't I drive you over?" "Don't you have a class or something?" "Free period," she said. "I was going to spend it in the library with my psych text, but I can spare a few minutes. Just give me half a minute to clear some space for you." She opened the passenger door and quickly shoved the clutter from the front passenger seat and floor onto the clutter already piled in back. Checked quickly for spilled soda, grease, old gum. "All clear." "Have a seat," she said. Alex was quiet on the drive over to Marshall Field, which was really at the ass end of the campus. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Alex looking at her legs. She smiled briefly, then turned a little red when she realized he'd been checking out the moon and star tattoos above her right ankle. Her legs were in good shape from all the exercycling she did, but they were pale even for a New Englander. Alex hardly seemed to notice. After a few moments, the silence weighed too heavily upon her. "So what's the real reason for the sunglasses?" she asked. "Anything to do with that scar over your eye?" "What if I told you I was the Witness Protection Program story?" "Sorry, Charlie. It's much more interesting, really." "I demand the truth, Mr. Dunkirk." "Ice skate," he said. "Skating?" "Ice hockey, actually," he said. "As a Minnesotan, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I really suck at hockey." She laughed good-naturedly. "I went down, spun out of control, and got an ice skate lodged right about there." He poked a scar. "Ouch!" "Blood on the ice that day," he said. "I can see fine, but ever since I'm really sensitive to bright light, even fluorescent lighting. Sadly, the glasses are much more than a shallow affection. This is where I get off." She pulled up the gravel driveway to the fence around Marshall Field. It was an unmaintained track surrounding Danfield's old football field, used mainly for scrimmages now. The bleachers had fallen into a severe state of disrepair, condemned, actually, and the field was now generally deserted. Wendy got out of the car and walked with him to the gate. "Thanks for the lift," he said. "No problem," she said, wondering why she was lingering around. "Guess I better get going." "Right," he said. "The library." She nodded, still standing there. Say something, stupid, Wendy thought, then realized she wasn't sure if that thought was directed to Alex or to herself. You're going to need a ride back." "Don't worry about it," he said. "That'll be my cool down." "I don't mind," she said. "It's quiet here. Actually, it's quieter than the library. I'll just sit and read my psych book. I have no fear of condemned bleachers." "Okay," he said. "Thanks. I appreciate it." As Alex made his first lap around the track, Wendy settled in and heard a slight creak beneath her. Maybe a healthy fear of condemned bleachers was called for, after all. The rusting steel framework was the last obstacle preventing the long wooden bench seats from becoming several tons of mulch. Alex rounded the far turn of the track, streaking by the visiting team bleachers. In a few moments he would come around the near turn, and she didn't want him to catch her staring at him like a lovesick little fool. Maybe offering to stick around had been a little over the top. She could have offered instead to stop by after the library. Alex passed in front of her, and she waved, but was suddenly struck by a sharp pain surging down her fingers to her fingernails. They ached as if someone were squeezing them with pliers. She examined them and saw the lavender crescent at the base of each fingernail had darkened and spread. Now the entire surface of each nail was tinted a deep shade of purple, reminiscent of winter days so cold her hands ached and her rings slid easily around her fingers like tiny bracelets. Alex was heading for the far turn. Wendy stared down at her purple fingernails. "He'll think I'm weird," she whispered. "God, why am I so weird?" She stared down at her purple fingernails. "And what the hell is happening to me?" By the time Art staggered out of the woods carrying the little girl, his back was screaming at him in 4 different languages. He dropped her without ceremony on the gravel shoulder of Old Winthrop Road, but she didn't seem to notice, and leaned against his parked Volkswagen bug, leaning forward with hands on his knees and waiting for the searing pain to subside. When he'd recovered, he managed to wrestle the sleeping child into the passenger seat without doing himself any further injury. He'd been drinking a big gulp on the drive here, and now he soaked an old T-shirt from the back seat with the remaining ice chips for a cold compress. She recoiled at the touch of the damp cloth, her lip curling back from her teeth in a soundless snarl. Hospital or police? He didn't know the protocol for lost children, though the high fever was tipping the scales toward hospital. Weren't fevers particularly dangerous in children? He vaguely recalled a medical acronym, FIB, Fever in Baby. He started the Volkswagen and peeled out from the roadside with a spray of gravel. As he navigated the winding road back into town, he kept glancing over at the little girl. He hadn't managed to get the seat belt on her, and now he wished he'd taken the extra time to secure her. Thanks to the jostling ride, her fingers had slipped free of her mouth, and now her lips worked feebly, recalling a newborn's sucking reflex. Art leaned over to lift her dangling hand back up to her mouth, noting now that her middle fingers were elongated, calloused, dark beneath the nails. Christ, what's wrong with this kid? Art thought. Then saw he'd allowed the Volkswagen to wander into the oncoming traffic lane. He swerved back into his lane. The violent motion shifted the little girl against the door, and she groaned. "It's okay, honey," Art said, hoping she could hear him, hoping he sounded more convincing than he felt. "I won't do that again." She responded with a low growl. His blood ran cold. He glanced over and saw her eyes. The lids were open now, though the eyes were rolled so far back in their sockets he only saw the pupilless whites. And then she sat bolt upright. Art swerved, reacting as she flew at him. He tried to pull away, but she came at him across the brief space separating them, shrieking like a feral thing. He tried to throw up his hands in defense against her snapping teeth, and the Volkswagen went out of control. He felt them hurtle into a spin, felt a sudden stabbing pain as her diseased fingers found his right eye, saw the sickly crescents of her own eyes, a yellow-white beneath fluttering lids, as wham! The Volkswagen glanced off something on the roadside, and they were weightless for one suspended instant before the impact. And the little girl was jerked away from him as if by a cable. With his one remaining eye, Art had this time slowed image of her sailing backward through a curtain of glass. He lost consciousness almost instantly, and so he didn't hear the broken sounds of the next few minutes. The hiss of the ruined engine's radiator, the tinkle of bits of metal falling free of the wreck, the whimpers of the frightened little girl somewhere out of view. Only the approaching sirens managed to penetrate the deep, receding blackness into which he plunged, like a stone dropping down a well, and by the time they arrived, even they weren't loud enough to find him where he'd gone. She dreams like she's flying, not like a bird tethered to earth, beating its wings to stay aloft on the currents. No, she is different, weightless, drawn to a different gravity, the gray and silent moon, looming above like a watchful parent. She swoops above the patchwork landscape, taunting the earth. Below sprawls her hunting grounds, fields, a farmhouse, a town, huts of wattle and daub, homes of timber, each golden with window light. They hide indoors tonight, her prey. She tastes their hearth smoke on the wind. A giddy rush of vertiginous flight, and the town rushes up to meet her. Gliding past, she sees the town hall, church spire, homes huddled like children. She swoops above the rooftops and descends effortlessly to the grassy commons, where livestock stand in stupid clusters. Gliding silently down among them now, she sees the cows roll the whites of their eyes. Sheep scatter, bleating in fear. Suddenly, she realizes she is not alone on the common. She sees a man, staggering, a drunk, coming across the common. He stops at the sight of her. His clothing is wrong, ragged and crude. His eyes go wide, and she smells his piss as it soaks his pant leg. He retreats a step, turning to run, and she comes shrieking at him. Pointing at her accusingly, he screams, "Witch!" Wendy woke with a start, banging her head against the bathtub soap shelf. Lavender flowers clung to her body wherever it emerged from the water. All the images of the recurring nightmares were as familiar to her as her own backyard, but each time she awoke the fear was fresh and the details dissipated like smoke rings, eluding her grasp. It would be comforting to chalk up the colonial dreams to her comp lit course's study of gables, but the dreams had come before she'd started reading the book. Of course, the parallel was hardly helping matters, and she certainly wasn't looking forward to the Scarlet Letter. Obviously, she was identifying with the people of colonial times. Sometimes it seemed they were being persecuted, other times preyed upon. But was she observer or participant? Wendy was feeling more like an outsider than she ever had in high school. Could it all be just anxiety dreams? It didn't matter, really. She had decided to go through with the ceremony. Her knees rose from the bathwater like the coils of some sleek sea serpent. The Loch Ness monster, she thought. She flipped the drain switch with her toe, stood and used the shower head to rinse clinging lavender petals from her body. The cleansing power of the flowers and her meditation in the bath were both designed to prepare her for her ritual that night. Sleep hadn't been part of the plan, but was clear evidence she was now centered, relaxed. She walked to her bedroom wrapped in a towel, hoping she hadn't slept too long. That morning she decided her out-of-body exercise bike tour would take a turn west to New Orleans, her next colorful stop, rather than continuing down to Key West and back up the Florida Peninsula. Second thoughts began to trouble her, but she pushed them back. It's not that It's not as if she were going to be sitting in the middle of the quad. She would be utterly discreet, completely secluded, nothing to worry about. She dressed in a cotton blouse and baggy slacks. From the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, she removed a white linen robe belted with a soft rope and a smaller wooden chest she would take with her to the forest glade. She crept quietly down the stairs, praying they wouldn't squeak. It was 7:30, and she could hear the television, her parents talking softly. All clear. She carried the chest and robe down to the basement. Regrettably, she shared the basement with her father. His end looked like the set of a cable access show. A paneled room with a missing fourth wall. His mounted game trophies, bucks with massive antlers and glass eyes, hung from two walls. Against the back wall was a desk with a leather chair. 2 hunting rifles and a 12-gauge shotgun rested on wall racks. She called his side of the basement the hunting horror. Between her father's room and Wendy's end of the basement was the old wooden frame pyramid Wendy's father had built for her 2 years ago, after a lot of coaxing. She'd finally convinced him the pyramid would help her geometry grade. Back then, she could often be found meditating on a folding chair within the confines of the pyramid, absorbing its ancient mystical energies. Or so she had hoped. Wendy's side of the basement was separated from the hunting horror by a linen curtain and a state of mind. When she pulled the curtain along its ceiling track, the basement became her herb cellar. On tiered wooden shelves mounted above an old desk, her herbs, seeds, flowers, and stones were separated and labeled, each variety in a separate airtight jar. For simplicity and portability, the herbs and flowers were labeled in linen bags in their jars, the stones protected in muslin pouches. She selected bags of sage leaves and chamomile flowers, ground monkshood rootstock and leaves, then a small sachet of anise flowers. Next, she took a flat gray moonstone, rose quartz, and a jagged tektite stone. On a last-minute whim, she grabbed her red jasper. From the center desk drawer, she took several sheets of parchment and a charcoal stick. Finally, from the bottom shelf, she removed a full mandrake rootstock, her prized possession. The root of mandragora resembled a human figure and had been considered magical since primitive times. Anyone found to possess the root during the Middle Ages had been summarily accused of witchcraft. Wendy placed each of these items, along with a mortar and pestle, in a large duffel bag she kept beside the desk. She gathered up her robe and wooden chest and went back up the steps, pausing to listen for anyone in the kitchen. Satisfied, she snatched her car keys from a hook on the wall and slipped quietly out the back door. She circled around to the front of the mansion, hoping the sprinkler system wouldn't pick that moment to douse her. She hurried down the horseshoe driveway, slipped into the gremlin, placing her bundle of items on the seat beside her. Remarkably, the car started on the first try. The sky had darkened already, but the night air was dry and not too cool. She had worried that it might be too cold at night to follow through with her plans, but so far, so good. As she pulled out of her driveway and cut over to College Avenue, she saw the first of the roving packs of Friday night revelers, 6 girls working the Gap's fall fashion line. Standard issue accessories, the hoop earrings, the chunky black shoes, the boyfriend's baseball cap. On College Avenue, the pedestrian traffic was the heaviest. Whiskered fish in tie-dye and dreadlocks, Birkenstocked Liliths with their goateed lampreys. There were a trio of predatory lacrossers, all teeth and testosterone, cruising these waters for a sorority fry, and there went whole schools of identical frosh carried along on the whims of the tide. She turned onto Gable Road, its blacktop beginning to crumble around the edges. She passed the Wendell Motel and Restaurant and glanced at her odometer. The clearing, her clearing, was less than 2 miles ahead. She had centered herself. She was ready to perform the ritual, the ceremony. She smiled, then bit down on her lower lip at the sudden thrill that filled her, an exquisite anticipation of the unknown. Jack Carter made a habit of driving over the speed limit. Speed limits were designed for people with normal reflexes. As a well-conditioned athlete, he should be able to operate a motor vehicle at higher speeds than your average slack-jawed Joe Beerbelly could. And frankly, the quicker he got through depressing little Wendell, the better. Oh, yeah, freshman orientation had been a real hoot. The town was so fucking proud of itself and its heritage of witchcraft. They slapped a stinking historical monument plaque on every other building. Must be the odd-numbered ones that got the special treatment. None of that mattered at the moment, of course. He'd finally asked Jensen Hoyt out instead of Cindy Sellers. He'd better not tell Jen he'd made the final decision with the flip of a coin. It had been a literal toss-up between the two. They both acted like they'd enjoy some quality time with him, but neither seemed inclined to share. Cindy had the better rack, but Jen was slender, with a nice little ass. And he really liked Jen's generous smile. Jen's smile seemed legit. Whenever Cindy smiled, he had the uneasy feeling she was smirking. At him, maybe. Jen was an art history major and always carried that damn sketch pad with her. Even tonight, she'd tossed it on the back seat. He'd left the top off of his roll-bar Jeep because he liked the rush of air as it whipped around the windshield. After the next major pothole, he expected the sketch pad to fly out the back. Whatever. Maybe sometime he'd pose for her if she wanted. He looked over at her and could tell she was just as excited by the rush of air whipping back her long, straight black hair. She was wearing a white, sleeveless sweater with a plunging neckline to show off what little merchandise she had up top and a short, peach-colored skirt that was blowing back up her thighs. If she hadn't kept her hand pressed to the material, the "what color are your panties" question would be answered in short order. Maybe she went au naturel down there. Jack smiled at the thought. Jen noticed Jack's smile and responded with one of her own high-wattage come-hither looks. "Where are we eating?" she asked. "Best place in this weak little burg," Jack said. "Moody Inn. Got a bud works there, won't give my fake ID a second look." When they arrived at the Moody Inn and Tavern, established 1660 according to the obligatory plaque, Jack parked the Jeep himself. He never let the valet dipshits touch his wheels. "Thanks, but no thanks, bro." Jen waited for him to open her door. Well, la-dee-da, so he walked around and held it open for her, getting an eyeful of her legs as she stepped down, one hand on his shoulder for balance. She was about 4 inches shorter than his 6'2". Tall for a girl, but a good fit. He hated slow dancing with short girls. Their asses were completely out of reach unless he hunched over like a fucking troll. Jen finger-combed her long black hair behind her ears, then patted down her skirt before they went through the iron-bound oak doors. Just as long as she didn't feel the need to reapply the minimal amount of makeup she wore, Jack was cool. Jack ignored the maitre d' and signaled for his frat brother, Rich, as if he were hailing a cab. After Rich had a brief, whispered exchange with the maitre d', Jack and Jen were seated at one of Rich's tables. The maitre d' left 2 menus on the table with a curt nod. After he left, Rich stepped forward and said, "Man's got a major stick up his ass. Can I get you something to drink?" "Just roll a keg of Coors up to the table, my man," Jack said. Jen ordered a strawberry daiquiri. "Okay, make like you're showing me some ID." Jack reached into his wallet and whipped out his student ID. Rich nodded, then looked to Jen, who fished a credit card out of her clutch purse. Rich nodded, hurried off, and returned a few minutes later with a draft beer and a daiquiri. Jack looked to Jen, who nodded. Jack ordered the ribeye, rare. Jen, who frowned slightly at Jack's choice of entree, asked for the vegetarian platter. After Rich took their menus away, Jen leaned forward and asked Jack about the football team. "Can't complain," he said. "I made starting quarterback by the first game of the season. We're 2-1. We would be undefeated if our special teams didn't suck ass." "Do you ever dream about making it to the pros?" "Let's be honest, okay? I'm not exactly playing in the Big Ten," Jack said, swigging his beer. "Blew out my ACL my junior year in high school, in a scrimmage, for Christ's sake. Can you imagine that? Don't get me wrong, I've got the arm strength, but I'm about as mobile in the pocket as a three-wheeled wagon. Turns out Danfield's football program has been a joke 5 years running. They offered me a full scholarship knowing I was damaged goods. Who knows? Maybe it will even be worth their while." "Well, you're certainly off to a good start," she said. Jack smiled, nodded. That's what he thought. Always look on the bright side. "What about you? How long have you been doodling on sketchpads?" "Probably since I could pick up a crayon," she said. "Not that that's my choice of artistic medium anymore." Jen seemed to think she'd made some sort of joke that Jack wasn't getting, but he smiled anyway to humor her. She was thinking that Jack was the kind of guy who got ahead in the world, a natural leader. You had to be a leader to be a quarterback, right? To lead your team to victory? That's the kind of thing businesses look for. Jen surely didn't want to get stuck with some introspective, navel-gazing loser. Guys who weren't take charge Guys who weren't take charge material were always on the sidelines, watching the other guys grab the glory. So what if he was a little self-absorbed? She preferred to think of it as natural-born confidence, a healthy ego. She could be the introspective, artistic one in the relationship. Christ, a relationship? This was a first date, no more. Throughout their meal, Jen made sure to keep the small talk going, trying to keep Jack comfortable, and trying, most of all, not to ask Jack why he had to eat his meat so bloody. The gremlin sputtered in complaint as Wendy slowed through gravel and litter on the shoulder of Gable Road. When she saw a battered hubcap, she slowed to a stop. She had found the spot. Under the driver's seat, she found the old T-shirt she used whenever she checked her oil. She tied the shirt to her door handle so any passerby would assume she had abandoned the car and had walked to the nearby gas station for assistance. That should delay any embarrassing investigations, at least for the few hours she would need to perform her ritual. She gathered her belongings from the passenger seat, locked the car, and took her keys with her. After a minute or two, she located the winding trail, probably used by deer as a runway before launching themselves between automobiles. She ducked and dodged often to avoid the tangle of branches above, stepping carefully to avoid the deadwood below. She was surprised to find herself remembering her childhood fear of the dark, a primal tremor. Her brief journey was made more difficult by the burden in her arms, but soon she saw the bright disk of the full moon high overhead, its light shining through the silvery leaves of the ash tree on the far side of her chosen glade. The clearing was roughly 15 feet long and 8 feet across. This was the clearing she had discovered over a year ago on her field trip with the wire hanger, the place where she had found the ash tree and the fly agaric toadstools, Frankie's magic mushrooms. If she continued through the woods, on a line away from Gable Road, she'd eventually come out into Bonsall Park, where that long-ago field trip had begun. Now she stood in the center of the clearing, her grove. She placed her bag on the ground, laid her robe on top of it, then opened the wooden chest and removed her meditation mat. Next, she brought out a jar of flour and pointed a peg. Next, she brought out a jar of flour and a pointed peg, which she used to dig a groove in the dirt. When she was finished, she filled the rut with flour poured through a paper funnel to form a white circle on the ground. She put away the jar and peg, then used a compass to mark east, south, west, and north. She placed 4 white candles, each in an antique brass holder, at each point of the compass. She then set a bowl of rice beside the north candle to represent earth, to the west a silver cup filled with wine to represent water, to the south a brass burner filled with kindling to represent fire, and lastly, to the east, her latest antique store find, a brass incense holder with holes for 3 sticks representing air. She unfolded her meditation mat in the center of the circle, lit the candles and the incense, then laid out her pouches with the mandrake root on top of the wooden chest. Careful not to break the white line, she stepped outside the circle with her folded linen robe and duffel bag. The robe had sleeves, but she wrapped it around her body like a cape, keeping her arms free within it. She tied the robe at her neck, but left the waist unbelted. She looked around nervously then, the light cast by the 5 fires dancing with the shadows. For a moment she thought she saw an animal moving back in the brush, a deer or something smaller. But she was confident the fire would keep it away, whatever it was. She took a deep breath and thought, now or never. Whenever she felt self-doubt, she would issue a challenge, a dare to herself. Her arms moved within the loose confines of the robe, her fingers unbuttoning her blouse from top to bottom. She slid it off her shoulders, then tugged each sleeve down separately. After she folded the blouse and placed it in her duffel bag, she kicked off her shoes, unfastened her slacks, and stepped out of them. Finally, she removed her bra and panties and carefully placed them in the bag as well. Then, wearing just the robe, she stepped back into the circle. She stood on her mat for a moment, her senses prickling. She could taste the blended, acrid tang of candle smoke and incense, and behind these scents the rich, earthy musk of the forest. Beneath the soft robe, her entire body felt electrified. It was a feeling of exhilaration that made her wonder if she might be a closet exhibitionist. Somehow she had never dared take her magic this far. She listened for the sounds of the night. But the forest was silent, and she felt a powerful isolation in the dark, the moon shining down on her alone. Even within the circle of fire, the night was chilly. Why am I hesitating? I'm all alone. I have no reason to be afraid, right? What's the worst that could happen? Okay, the worst would be an arrest for indecent exposure. No, that wouldn't be the worst. The worst would be if everyone at Danfield knew I'd been arrested of indecent exposure. And her father's position as college president. Oh, God! She spent several seconds trying to control her breathing, the nervous trembling of her body, trying to ignore the heightened sense of the soft cloth of the robe rubbing her bare flesh. Stop that! I'm just being silly. I'm all alone. You can't make a fool of yourself by yourself. Okay? Okay then, go ahead. I dare you. She reached for the collar string knot, tugged it loose. Alex Dunkirk felt like a grade A creep, a real bottom feeder. At least he was above classifying his activities as surveillance. That was way too noble a word for what he was doing. Spying? No. Still too self-important. Stalking? Bingo. Give the man a coop-eye dog. Stalking and peeping? Now you're hitting a little too close to home. Sure, he'd been curious about Wendy's hobby, if you could call it that. He'd heard a whispered rumor here and there about witchcraft or white magic in reference to Wendy. Frankie Leonard called it Wicca, and she seemed close enough to Wendy to know something of the truth of it. Until then, Alex had assumed all the whispers were sheer rumor. It was expected in a town that celebrated a history steeped in witchcraft, and Wendy was a local who invariably dressed in black, wore handmade silver jewelry and crystal pendants. At first he'd merely thought she was a bit more interesting than your average co-ed. She defied categorization in any of the standard cliques that served to categorize most of the 3,000 students attending Danfield. She was attractive without seeming preoccupied with her appearance. She almost dared you to find the beautiful girl beneath all the witchcraft trappings, an impressionist painting that could only be appreciated from a discreet distance. So why the compulsion to follow her on this night of all nights? Did he really expect to witness some black mass, a human sacrifice, a bubbling cauldron? He supposed he could blame Frankie. After all, she'd been the one who planted the seed in their calc class, told him about this ritual Wendy was going to perform. Frankie not only confirmed the Wicca rumors he had been hearing about Wendy, but had also actually mentioned what night she would perform this mysterious ceremony. Alex had been hooked. He had to see it for himself. And so now he watched with utter fascination, hidden behind the trunk of an old maple, as she unfastened the neckties of the robe and let it drop down around her ankles. A lambent moment hung in the balance as he stared at her nakedness. golden and pure in the candlelight, with a mixture of pride and chagrin. She truly was unique and wonderful, and a lovely girl besides. A splendor of nature before him, communing with the earth. In that moment she was a vision of all he could ever want, secretly revealed to him, a grandeur so simple and extraordinary that it brought a hard lump to his throat. He was completely unworthy of her. The magical moment burst like a child's soap bubble, and he felt as if a slimy coating had descended over him, tainting him in his own eyes, if not yet in hers, his physical arousal only making it worse. The moment passed as she sat down within the circle of her fallen robe. Strangely, it felt like a dismissal. He was an outsider here, uninvited and unwelcome. Just as she had turned her back to him, nature chose to exclude him at this moment. This was not how he wanted to see her, and it certainly wasn't how he wanted to see himself. Slowly, he backed away from her clearing, her moment alone in the night. Backed away so that he would know if she turned and saw him. Frankie should have kept her damn mouth shut. Despite her own warped agenda about male-female relationships and occasional feminist diatribes, he'd assumed she was playing the role of matchmaker, not saboteur. Enough of that, he told himself as he jogged back to Jessie Oswald's station wagon. It took several tries to turn over the engine, but once he was back on Gable Road, he made it a point not to look back. Jensen Hoyt's plan had misfired. She had boosted Jack's ego so much that he'd lost all restraint, thinking there was no way he could lose with her. He might as well have had a keg sitting beside him for all the beer he'd gone through. Talked so much he'd left most of his bloody, soggy meat sitting on his plate all night for her to stare at and be repulsed by. Out in the parking lot, he was walking with a swagger that had become more stagger than anything else, his arm looped heavily over her shoulders as he sneaked glances down her sweater. She wasn't wearing a bra, but her white camisole was probably giving him fits. Not that she minded the visual attention, but he smelled like a brewery, and she doubted he'd be able to drive his Jeep in his present condition. "Maybe we should call a cab," she suggested. "Fuck we need a cab for," he said. "Got my Jeep. Soon as I can remember where I parked it. Aha, there she blows." "It's a little chilly, Jack," she said. "So I noticed," he said with a big smirk and wink and a tug at her sweater. "I meant it might be more cozy in the back of a cab." "Don't worry, I expect things to get heated up soon enough." "Are you sure you're okay to drive?" she asked, finally taking the risk of coming across as judgmental. "I'm fine," he said, standing up straight. "What, you want to give me a field sobriety test?" "I guess not," she said, and let him help her into the Jeep. She watched closely as he pulled out of the lot. They drove for what seemed like miles. "Look at that shit," Jack said, suddenly jabbing his finger at the windshield. At first, Jen thought he was literally complaining about a blob of bird shit on his windshield, or maybe a splattered bug. Then she saw he was pointing to the old factory ahead. "It's a mill, I think," she said, "an abandoned textile mill." He turned the Jeep into the back road that paralleled the mill. Through a stand of trees, she could see the old brick building with holes for windows. She shuddered, thinking it looked like a swell home for ghosts. And Jack was having trouble staying on this narrow lane that circled up toward a covered trestle bridge. She saw a sign indicating they were about to drive over Miller Creek. Jen wondered if they'd been driving through Miller Creek. "Jack, I've never driven a Jeep," Jen said, groping for enough tact to get her out of this situation in one piece. "It must be really exciting. Can I drive for a little while, back here where it's safe?" She was hoping once she was behind the wheel he'd nod off. For a moment she thought her ploy had worked. He swung the Jeep roughly to the side of the road. "Nobody drives the Jeep but me," he said. "Don't think I don't know what you're trying to do." "I just wanted to see what it felt like," Jim said, feigning innocence. Just how shit-faced was he, anyway? "It's got to be exciting," she said, squeezing his thigh for emphasis. Maybe if he thought it would get him laid, he'd turn the keys over. Otherwise, she was in for a long walk down the main strip to hitch a ride back to the dorm. The bastard. What, you trying to make it worth my while, huh? He said with a lewd wink. Maybe, she said, really struggling to prop up her smile. Her face felt glassy. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a joint, which he lit with a disposable lighter. He pulled on it with a ludicrous intensity. Want some? He asked. She couldn't help it. She rolled her eyes at him. Why not put out a fire with some lighter fluid, you dipshit? Got some PCP in the other pocket? She was starting to reach the conclusion that Jack was a self-destructive asshole, and that was definitely not in her plans. You know, my father played for the Lions, Jack said. The Detroit Lions. Caught a pass in one of those fucking Thanksgiving Day games, if you can believe that shit. Tight end. Wasn't even the starter. Jack shook his head with a bitter laugh. I think he was cut before the end of the year. 3 fucking months of pro ball, and you know what? He never forgot it. Never lets me forget it. What happened? Jen asked. I don't know, Jack said, making short work of the joint. He doesn't talk about that part too much. I think he just wasn't good enough. Anyway, what difference does it make? He was there, and I never will be. That's just about sums it the fuck up, doesn't it? It's not a big deal, Jack, Jen said, taking his arm. You can make your mark in other ways. Right, he said, with another bitter laugh. Maybe I'll win the Nobel fucking prize. Give me that, Jen said, with her best leering smile. Jack held up the joint. This? No shit? He handed it to her, what little was left of it. She tossed it out of the Jeep. Oh, what the fuck do you do that for? Because, she said, grabbing his square jaw in her hand, turning his face toward hers and kissing him wetly on the mouth. Well, in that case, he returned her kiss, adding a little tongue. She took his hand and slid it up under her sweater, letting him get a good feel. She pressed her lips to his ear and whispered, Why don't you let me drive us back to my dorm? But she'd miscalculated. Jack jerked away from her with a curse. Forget it. Just forget it, okay? You're not driving the fucking Jeep. You can keep your cozy little tits to yourself. Fine, Jen said. I'll walk back to campus. Be my guest, Jack said. He took the keys out of the ignition and climbed out of the Jeep. Now what are you doing? Making my little contribution to the Historical Society of Wendell, Jack said. He rummaged around in the back of the Jeep and found a can of black spray paint he'd obviously used before. He shook the can vigorously, the little mixing pebble rattling around as he walked to the covered bridge spanning Miller Creek. My own little commemorative witch plaque. Jen sat in the Jeep, arms crossed, biting down on her lips. At least he wasn't trying to drive anymore. Maybe he'd pass out from his little excursion, though she'd have a devil of a time dragging him back to the Jeep. She watched him passively as Jack spray-painted a lopsided pentagram on the side of the bridge, leaning precariously out over the creek with one hand. A chill wind had suddenly kicked up, swaying the tree branches. Clots of dark clouds scudded across the sky. Dry leaves, autumn's early fallout, skittered across the blacktop. You're going to break your neck, Jack. Such an asshole, she thought. You know what? He said. This little thing lacks the artistic statement I'm going for. How about a big old fucking pentagraph they can see from planes passing overhead? Now that's a fucking canvas even Jensen Hoyt could be proud of. Am I right? He somehow managed to grab hold of a tree branch and swing himself up on the peaked roof of the covered trestle bridge without dropping his can of spray paint or pitching headfirst into the creek. He made a wobbly ascent to the peak. Would marvels never cease? Nice view, Jack said. You should bring up that sketch pad. Really, he laughed. Jack, just get down, okay? You know what? Screw the pentagram, he said. Maybe I'll just write Jen Hoyt's a big cock tease instead. Bet they'd see that up in first class. He laughed, bent over, and began spray painting the sloped roof of the covered bridge. You're a royal asshole, Jack Carter, Jen said, not caring any more. She'd walk back to the dorm and let him break his neck up there. Serve him right. She was climbing out of the Jeep when Jack exclaimed, What the fuck? She looked up at him and saw he was looking up into the sky. Did you see that? He asked. There was a sound among the topmost branches, clacking violently together as if a body had been tossed through them. Leaves rained down like the confetti. Jen rubbed herself to get rid of the sudden chill she felt, something unnatural, an icy breath down her spine. "Jack, get down!" Jack had lost interest in his graffiti. He was turning in a slow, awkward circle as he straddled the peak of the covered bridge. He was looking up, not at his footing. "Biggest damn thing I ever," he said, still searching the sky. A long shadow rippled across the road, up the side of the bridge, fluttered across Jack as he stood skylined on the bridge. The backwash brought a sour smell to Jen's nostrils, part sewage, part rotting flesh, part maggot-ridden garbage. Her hand clamped over her mouth as she fought back the gag reflex. "Jesus," Jack said hoarsely. Jen had the feeling all the alcohol and marijuana had been miraculously flushed from his system. Clean and sober, he looked at her. "Did you see that fucking It streaked up from behind him, out of the sky, darker than the shadows it had cast, a gleam of long teeth and baleful eyes as its clawed hands snatched him off the roof of the bridge as a hawk snatches a rabbit. Its eyes met Jen's, and she thought it let out a predator's shriek, but she couldn't be sure. Jack's scream drowned out any sound the flying creature had made as he writhed in its grasp, completely overwhelmed by the size of the thing. In a moment it was gone, lost to the night with its prey. Jen staggered against the jeep, her legs all but completely numb. She wondered at how she could still hear Jack screaming. A long time passed before she realized the raw, primal sound was coming from her own throat. Getting good, ain't it? Wendy sat naked and alone in the moonlight, cross-legged in the circle of cloth formed by her fallen robe. A wave of goosebumps flowed down her arms and legs. "I hope I remember everything. What happens? Will anything happen if I get it wrong? Screw up something?" She faced east, the direction of sunrise and new days, hope and opportunity. Before she could commune with each element, she must find her center, her core, her own essence, everything that was Gwendolyn Alice Ward. Long minutes passed, her eyes closed, her breathing deep and regular, before she felt completely at peace. All tension and distracting emotions dissolved like ice in a glass on a hot summer day. She opened her eyes, her gaze to the east. With a wood stove match, she lit the sandalwood incense sticks in the antique holder. She watched the smoke rise, forming ribbons lighter than air, imagined herself being carried up into the sky in the embrace of those tendrils. "Welcome my mind to your essence, air," she said. Did the incense smoke drift nearer her? She turned to the south. The burner greedily consumed the kindling. She imagined herself as flame, as fire, hot and passionate, demanding and bright. "Welcome, my heart, to your essence, fire," she said. She faced west, the silver cup of wine shining in the candlelight. She pictured herself as liquid, water flowing, caressing all of life, supporting it, but first producing it, the ancient home. "Welcome my life to your essence, water." She sipped the wine, tasted the sweetness and tang of life as it rushed through her, warmed her, claimed her. She turned to the north, facing the bowl of rice, uncooked, because she planned no earth magic tonight. Still, she must recognize the element. She gave her thoughts to the embrace of the ground. Earth Mother gave life and received death, just payment. "Welcome, my body, to your essence, Earth," she said. Finally, she faced east again to close the circle. "Now I begin," she thought, trying to quiet her nerves. She had purified her stones in a freshwater stream, but she had bought the herbs in a store, even though the crystal path was where she worked. It was not as pure as growing or finding your own herbs in the wild, and she needed to consecrate them before she made her magic. She offered each to the essence of the four elements. She ground the chamomile flowers with the mortar and pestle, mixed them with her jar of spring water in a ceramic cup, and drank the infusion. Then she tied the sachet of anise flowers to a crystal pendant. These flowers would awaken in her body the powers she needed for magic. Ready for the first spell. As she had with the chamomile, She ground the sage leaves into a coarse powder, but this time she poured the powder into the palm of her hand and faced east. This would be an air spell for the health and beauty of Professor Glazer's unborn baby, a girl. She should probably even give her professor a charm, and would have already if she knew it would be accepted in the spirit it was given. She visualized her holding a healthy baby girl. Air, please carry now the good of this sage on your swift and mighty winds. She inhaled a slow, deep breath, then blew forcefully, as if facing a birthday cake with 100 candles. The powder scattered, a momentary mist that rose and vanished in the branches far above her. I thank you, Air. The next spell was for her. She was tired of the verbal abuse so many of her classmates directed at her. While the code of white magic would not allow her to curse anyone, she felt justified in taking preemptive measures. She wrote quickly with a charcoal stick on a piece of parchment. In her left hand she held the tektite stone. In her right she held a corner of the parchment paper. She repeated the words scrawled in charcoal 3 times. Let others not attack by word or deed, and by the fire will Gwendolen be freed. She touched the corner of the parchment to the flame and let the ashes fall into the burner to complete the banishing. Next, she'd perform a healing spell to rid her of the pain and discoloration in her fingernails, and the psychological pain of the nightmares. She dropped the poisonous monkshod rootstock and leaves into her burner, then took out her rose quartz. In a few moments she retrieved the ashes and held them up in her hand where the light breeze would blow them from her. In her other hand she clutched the rose quartz to her chest, where she could feel her slow, steady heartbeat. O wind, please take away these things which ail me. I know, great wind, you will not fail me. The ashes fluttered from her palm. Before she began the next spell, she almost changed her mind. Oh, well, it's no big deal. Mother Nature would certainly understand. In a moment she had written another message on parchment paper, but not to burn. She held the red jasper, the stone she'd taken with her from home on a last-minute whim before the flame, felt the heat on her fingertips, saw the fire sparkle through the stone, investing it with the element's power. She read the message aloud 3 times as well. Bring to me a new romance, may fire consort with fate and chance. Then she carefully folded the paper in half 3 times and, together with the red jasper, placed it in a small box which she would keep sealed for a full cycle of the moon. She hoped she still had a chance with Alex, that she hadn't scared him off completely by hanging around at Marshall Field. Now she knew she should quit, but sitting on the ground, naked to the world and alone with the elements of nature, she felt unfettered and empowered, absorbing strength from her inner circle, while the outer circle maintained her power, kept it concentrated like white heat. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind was a seed of doubt, not doubt in her confidence, but doubt that she would ever come back to this clearing this way again. A feeling that what she was experiencing now was like dream strength, dream courage, and that when she awoke she would be amazed at the words she had said and things she had done while asleep. Just one more spell, she told herself, like nothing I've ever tried before, and the pure confidence was exhilarating. Wendy had missed the weather forecast, but the night sky was cloudless and starry. This could be the quickest proof of her power. Witches had been known to create storms, some to destroy crops, others to sink ships. But Wendy only wanted a small sign that the element's power flowed to her this night, to confirm that what she felt was real and not imagined. She began her meditation anew. She had read how to control the weather in one of her books, how to bring rain and storms. She crossed her arms below her throat, covering her crystal, concentrating on water, the feel of it as it dripped from her hair to her cheeks and shoulders, snaking down her back, the smell as it dampened her clothes, moistened the ground, the sound of it tapping the leaves, plunking in puddles, gathering and rushing in streams, the sight of it falling in countless drops, a procession of infinity. First she imagined, and her imagination was clear, completely focused on the rain that would come, must come. Then she visualized with a clarity that was breathtaking. In her mind, behind her closed eyes, the clouds gathered from afar and came as she beckoned. The winds marshaled to her command, gusting with a sense of primitive duty. The branches seemed to sway above her. The leaves rustled with an urgency that she alone could hear. The rush of air swept down and caressed her naked body, thrilling her every pore. The hair on the back of her neck bristled, and she shuddered with a chill that whipped down her spine with the speed and power of thought. She brought the clouds, mother of rains and father of thunder, soft and harsh, bright and dark, alive with lightning. So real were the sights and sounds and smell of the rain she had created in her mind that Wendy was surprised to discover that her hair was actually wet, that drops of water were falling from her eyebrows to her cheeks to the valley between her breasts, rolling softly over her abdomen. Her eyes opened wide. Beads of water clung to her eyelashes. She smiled, then laughed. She hugged herself, almost giddy with the thrill of it. "I did it!" she cried. "It really worked!" She clutched her pendant and looked up into the sky. A dark shape or shadow, her storm cloud, streaked across the sky unnaturally fast, with tendrils that flowed oddly like gesturing arms. And as quickly it was gone. Of course, it's magic! Lightning flashed without an accompanying crack of thunder. Slowly, though water still dripped from the leaves, she realized that the rain had stopped. Her rain had stopped. All she had wanted was a sign that what she had felt was real, and now there could be no doubt. The ground was not completely wet, but all the candles had been extinguished with protesting hisses. The burner flame flickered, sputtered, then regained strength. She noticed that her protective circle of flour had been broken in several places, no longer a complete ring. "You enjoyed the power," said an inner voice. Wendy shuddered from the cold, she thought. She reached for a woodstove match to relight the candles, but a sudden cramp caused her to stop short. She reached again, and again winced in discomfort. Her fingernails ached, as if she had held them in flame for a long time. Not again! She looked down, half expecting to see her nails cracked and blistered. They had lost their recent purplish hue and were now completely black. You enjoyed the power. She stood up, lifting the robe with her, but dropping it as another cramp doubled her over. The cramp was accompanied by downward pressure, below the stomach, pushing, pushing. She almost cried out, gasped instead, stumbled forward. Another cramp, worse still, and then the blood came. The thick, clotted flow streaked her inner thigh. She fell to her knees and wondered why it was a week early, why it was so painful this time. Why now? All her confidence was gone, extinguished as quickly as her candles had been. Her rapport with nature had been whisked away. The trees seemed menacing, concealing unimaginable horrors lurking in the dark. Nature had become a trap for the unwary. She wanted to be home in her bed more than anything. She was confused, but she knew several things. She knew that she must thank and dismiss the elements. She knew that she would dress quickly in just the robe if necessary, filling her duffel bag and wooden chest with all her belongings. Then she would stumble to the car and drive home, arriving well before her parents' rented film festival ended, sneaking into bed before them but not falling asleep until well after. She would suspect with dread certainty that one spell had consumed a week of her life in the blink of an eye, and she would wonder, before she dreamed the dreams again, if she just might be losing her mind. Jack Carter was flying. In those dizzying first moments he thought he was dying, thought the exhilarating rush of sight and sound was that last roller coaster moment before you plunge into the vortex. He saw stars, a blur of treetops, heard the screaming of the wind, and saw a scatter of distant house lights below him. Then he was dropped into darkness, and woke in darkness. But it was at least a lighter darkness than the oblivion of unconsciousness. He shifted, disoriented, and suddenly felt a lancing pain so fierce it made its own temporary flash of light, like a fountain of sparks behind his eyelids. He winced, testing his limbs, trying to pin the pain down, localize it. There, the overextended bones of his shoulders and arms. He couldn't move his right arm at all. Shit, his throwing arm. As his eyes began to adapt to the dark, he could make out a little more clearly where he was. Inside. At first he thought that he might be in a cave of some kind, but some sixth sense told him this place was man-made, wooden, and yet, confounding him, he saw high above a patch of night sky. Wherever he was had a patchy roof that let in the starlight. A barn. His nose discovered his location before his eyes. Beneath him was a thick layer of hay clumped with dirt and manure. Beyond those immediate smells were odors of old wood, chaff dust, the sweet stink of dead rodents, and something else. The instant he tasted that smell, his balls seized inside him, so powerfully had the odor become associated with terror. It was an animal stink, hot and ripe, like some sour mix of shit and burning hair and unwashed bodies, and yet he recognized it as human. It was a primal recognition of his own kind, but so much worse. He had to get out of here, out of this reeking darkness. Now that he knew he was in a barn, his eyes were able to unravel some of the puzzling geometries they saw. The place was old, like no barn he'd ever seen before. The support posts seemed hewn from whole trees and still bore the marks of amputated branches. He came up into a crouch and stood, wincing when his dislocated shoulder shifted outside its socket. He held the dead arm close to his side and took a shuffling step in the dark. Both his knees felt weak, unreliable. Even after the most brutal sack, you never let them see just how much you hurt. He took another step, regaining hope, strength with each inch of yardage. In the darkness, distances seemed to stretch. Another step. And then he fell. He let out a single yell as he dropped. The cry turned into an airless gasp as he landed hard, the wind driven out of him. He blacked out for a split second, a blink of unconsciousness. Then he was awake again, listening to the dusty rain of hay from the loft above. He sat very still, listening, hearing noises. He wasn't alone in the barn. Far above, huge black shapes unfolded themselves from their places among the rafters. "Go, get the fuck out!" Jack scrambled up, surprised he still had any strength in his arms and legs to stand and coordinate into a run. Pure adrenaline rush. He ran full tilt into a wall, then hit it again as he tried a second time to run through it, until he told his panicking mind to try another way out. He slid along the wall, hearing the dry, leathery sound of movement high above in the rafters. He wanted to push himself into the grain of the wood to hide in the knotholes. Then he found it, the door. It was warped, crude and tall, wide enough for livestock. Through a crack between door and wall, he smelled the clean breath of cool night air, bright as ice water. Behind him, the rafters boomed with the weight of the huge things leaping from one beam to the next. The door would not budge. Jack pressed himself through the crack, ignoring the pain in his sides, the narrow gap constricting his chest. Something gave and the door swung outward. He stumbled out into the cool night. He took several deep, agonizing breaths and cut right, an evasive maneuver, crashing headlong through tall grass and weed. He didn't look back. He fell, came up in a crouch, and kept going. Ahead were trees, pale trunks luminescent in the moonlight. If he could make it into the trees, maybe the things in the barn rafters wouldn't be able to find him. They were so goddamn big, maybe they'd have trouble maneuvering through the dense woods. These were the thoughts he whispered to himself in cold comfort. Just before he reached the trees, a foul blast of wind hit him. Jack gagged, stumbling against a tree as he puked up his dinner, the beers he'd drunk 100 years ago coming up again as acid. He ran, leaves clotting around his ankles. He tripped again and again, snagged by tendrils of vine and thorn bushes, tangling him like barbed wire. Then ahead he saw window light, a house just beyond the stand of trees. He veered in its direction, crashing through the underbrush and lunging out into the weed-choked backyard. The house was old, its roof buckling as the place sagged on its foundation. An ancient pickup truck stood in the driveway, the hulks of older cars decomposing around it. The screen door of the house clacked open and shut, an old man emerging onto the ramshackle porch. He met the crazed teen halfway across the yard. The old man held a shotgun. Jack nearly impaled himself on it as he staggered forward gratefully. Given what he'd been through tonight, a shotgun was nothing. "Something's after me! Please, you gotta help me!" Get back! The old man's eyes were black and glittering, and there was something wrong with his face. Please, they're coming, Jack said. We've got to get inside. The old man grunted. Yeah, they'll be along soon, he told Jack. His voice was crackled and gravelly with disuse. I'm sorry, son. What? Jack seized the old man by the shirt and tried to shake him. But despite his thin build, the old man was solid, like something carved of wood. His face was hard, weathered as old board, and fixed in an expression of infinite sadness, like the weary acceptance of a cenotaph martyr guarding the dead. Jack released his grip on the old man and took a step back. The old man's glittering eyes looked beyond Jack to the banshee wailing coming from the woods. Jack smelled the hot stench he'd smelled before, but didn't turn this time to look. The old man simply said, They're here for you, son. The ground thundered behind him. Finally, not really wanting to, he turned slowly and saw the death that had come for him. The three crooked shapes looming over him, as big as round as trees, almost 9 feet tall, seething with hunger. Vultures, he thought, with dread fascination, until he saw the clawed hands that reached for him. Only then did he understand. They tore him to pieces and fought amongst themselves for the scraps. And I do believe it is time for some more coffee.